Early in the morning, last year of November 3rd, I received a shocking message from my friend and colleague, Li Zehou. He wrote to me in an email that Professor Li Zehou, who was one of the most important people in my recent life, had passed away that night. Although we did not have a very close personal relationship, having met only a few times during his later years, I was closely connected to him through my professional work, especially during 2018 until 2020, when I wrote my 2 books on his philosophy and ethics. And that is also why I am here now and why I am participating in this conference and the commemorative volume in which we will critically examine and celebrate his philosophy. But I'm not only a fan of Li Zehou, I'm also a fan of the Frankfurt School philosophers, especially Theodor W. Adorno. Although unlike Li, I never met Adorno, I decided to study their philosophies from the point of view of how each of them developed and improved Marxist thought, especially with regard to its dialectics. I will try to place Li's view in a productive relation with Adorno's concept of the primacy of the object and his critique of identitarian philosophy, which is actually a philosophy based on the Hegelian dialectics, which aims to identify the consciousness and the concepts of the objects and the objects with which we are dealing. So he calls that identitarian philosophy. And I will conclude with a preliminary proposal for an alternative solution of these problems highlighted by Adorno. And this solution will be based on Li Zehou's concept of subjectivity, and especially also his application of the traditional Chinese concept of grasping the proper measure or do, with regard, of course, to the dialectic of the subject and object relation. And I will be focusing in this regard, particularly on the Confucian elements contained in Li's philosophy. So, for all the differences in the theoretical structures of Li Zehou and Adorno that are apparent at the first glance, a closer look reveals a remarkable number of similarities. And not all of these similarities can simply be attributed to the same zeitgeist and the largely same discursive foundation. What is certainly more interesting in this context are the differences that arise from this common ground. Since most of these differences can be traced to the different cultural and socio-political background on which the theories of these 2 great scholars were developed, they could be related to different paradigms of their respective traditions. Thus, a contrastive analysis of these differences might shed light on some aspects of the relationship between Chinese and European intellectual traditions. Through the lens of their particular views on the subject-object relationship, we will therefore start from their commonalities in order to place their differences in a framework that will allow us to construct a fruitful dialogue between the 2 philosophers, hopefully. Okay, let's begin. Li and Adorno were both active in the field of modern philosophy. They were both supporters of Marxist, especially early Marxist thought, and both were interested in aesthetics, especially in its social and political functions. Besides, the general epistemological basis of their respective theoretical models is a radical questioning of the ontological dualism that both scholars also regard as the foundation of modern Western thought. They both see this dualism as the result of the hypostatization of rationality that emerged from European Enlightenment and became a supposition with increasingly visible shortcomings. So, both scholars also assume a social nature or basis of human perception and understanding. In their view, objectivity is a social category and a coalesced social practice which manifests itself in the material and cultural production of human beings. Knowledge is therefore always socially constructed for both of them, and it cannot be simply and directly drawn from the external world. For both, then, there is no possibility of pure a priori knowledge. Any insight into reality is socially mediated, even if this mediation seems to be more directly conveyed in Adorno, and on the other hand, transmitted more via evolution in Li Zehou's work. So they both also assume, in a very general sense of the underlying ontology, a materialist worldview, even if Adorno's primacy of the object seems to offer a more complex and sophisticated problematization of the concepts of matter and form. The idea of human practice as an indispensable element, not only for grasping the objects of the external world, but also for being and becoming human, is shared by both philosophers. With regard to epistemology, both aim at developing a dialectical relation between the subject and the object of perception and knowledge. So in this context, I think Li Zehou can offer an alternative solution to the problem highlighted by Adorno, namely the problem of the impasse inherent in the dialectical scheme of what he called identitarian thought. As for the subject and object of cognition, both Li Zehou and Adorno are primarily interested in the nature of their mutual relationship. Adorno advocated the primacy of the object. So reality was no longer constituted by the subject. But in his negative dialectics, in his work, Negative Dialectics, Adorno warned that it is not the purpose of critical thought to place the object on the orphaned royal throne once occupied by the subject. On that throne, the object would be nothing but an idol. The purpose of critical thought is to abolish this hierarchy. So Li Zehou also followed a similar view of non-hierarchical relation between the subject and the object of comprehension. Even though he was always a zealous advocate of objectivity, he did not see it in an essentialist way, as most of his contemporaries did. So, similar to most followers of early Marxism, Li Zehou also considered practice as a key link that mediated the subject and the object. For Adorno, on the other hand, the reconciliation of subject and object was also of utmost importance. In spite of his persistent rejection of formulating a visionary alternative to the current problems of society, he offered his readers a glance of something similar to this vision in his so-called moment of peace, which was necessarily defined by an egalitarian and mutually complementary relation between subject and object. And he describes it in the following way. He says, in its proper place, even epistemologically, the relationship of subject and object would lie in the realization of peace among men, as well as between man and their other. Peace is the state of distinctness, without domination, with a distinct participating in each other. So such an idea of peace or reconciliation, however, was by no means feasible in the traditional dualistic model of dialectical opposites as in Hegel's Dialectics. So Adorno therefore strongly criticized the Hegelian schema, which strives for the identity of subjects and objects in a framework in which the antagonistic dichotomy of being and conceptuality is always reconciled in the identity of thought and reality. For Adorno, such an identitarian philosophy leaves no room for new insights, nor for a critique of reality. So the impasse arises from Hegel's adherence to the theoretical framework determined by the elementary laws of formal logic, namely the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, and the law of the excluded middle. Such a dialectic strives for the identity and thus unity of contradictions, a unity that is seen as the only way to know reality. These laws are products of a static framework of unchanging meanings that provides an instrumental basis for their validity. With his negative dialectics, in which identity does not disappear, but is qualitatively transformed, Adorno aims to overcome this model. In this new framework, the affinity of the object to the subject or to the thought of the object is reborn through mediation in a new identity. So, well, in this way, Adorno attempts to overcome the static foundations of identitarian ontology with a dialectic that turns against itself, because it simultaneously implies the impression and the critique of the illusory universal realm of being. The ultimate goal of the negative dialectics, however, is not to escape the delusive identitarian context. On the contrary, it aims to break out of this context from within. It is a dialectics that enables freedom of human thought, because Adorno's priority of the object denies the constitutive role of the epistemic subject. It surpasses traditional methods of achieving identity and unity of thought, since it allows for the diversity of objects and it does not impose on them the forms of the cognitive subject. But in the end, Adorno's critique, in my view, still proceeds from the same scheme of identifying thought, because it is still embedded in the static view of being, of reality. His negation of identity merely offers us a turn to a new concept, namely that of non-identity, still a concept. More importantly for him, however, non-identity as the central concept of negative dialectics offers the philosophy of a reflection on its own meaning, which for Adorno is the way out of the concept seeming being in itself as a unity of being. Well, let's take a look about Li Zehou's view on these issues. In his early thought, Li still adhered to Hegelian schema and its identitarian foundations. But later on, the mature Li found the way out by abandoning the Western style dialectics, along with all its negations and negations of negations, as we can see then in this quotation for the mature Li, not only the human conception of reality, but even the emergence and the constitution of beauty itself is closely related to the principle of complementarity, which has its origin in the oldest Confucian classics, namely the Book of Changes. In a sense, the epistemology of this traditional cosmological scheme can be compared to the dialectical model that prevailed in Western philosophy. For both systems represent a particular mode of interaction between two mutually opposing ideas. So, but this similarity is, of course, only on the surface, because they are still, the mode of this interaction is quite different. Due to its embeddedness into the framework of formal logic, the Western identitarian thinking can only function as a system in which every pair of oppositions is simultaneously a contradiction. Because in the identitarian schema, different ideas are necessarily mutually exclusive. They exclude each other. So they form a contradiction, not only an opposition. In contrast to such structures in the traditional Chinese correlative model, based on the principle of complementarity, pairs of opposites are not contradictions. They are not mutually exclusive, and they're often referred to as binary categories, duili fanchou, because it is based on processual paradigm. Because this model is based on processual paradigms, these categories complement each other, and they are interactive and also interdependent. They don't form any kind of contradiction. So in such a view, there can be no subject without an object and vice versa. Therefore, neither can assume a purely constitutive role. Li Zehou considers this model of correlative complementarity as a basic framework in which human subjectivity can actively seize the tool of dynamic proper measure do, to act, adapt to, and make reality just right. This model is clearly different from Adorno's idea with which he wanted to replace the traditional model of contradictions and identities triggered by the constitutive role of the subject. And he wanted to replace this model with a linear scheme in which subject and object constitute one another, but at the same time they depart from each other. Well, in my view, this was not very good thought through in Adorno's philosophy. But let's look back at this dynamic view of grasping the proper measure to do. In this dynamic scheme, do generates the ceaseless movement in which the subject and object of understanding are repeatedly separated and united, continuous and uninterrupted process of interdependent interaction is that. So in this respect, the difference between Adorno and Li is that the latter was equipped with different methodological paradigms than the former. And therefore, for Li Zehou, it was clear that subject and object cannot interact directly or quasi-automatically. The dialectical synthesis eliminated from Adorno's negative dialectics is also absent from the traditional Chinese principle of complementarity that guides the Chinese type of dialectical interactions. But in this complementary dialectics, synthesis is not a separate, isolated, and qualitatively new stage of dialectical development. Synthesis is something that in this model that arises from and is hidden in the very process of interaction between pairs of opposites as such. Indeed, in this model, subject and object or any other pairs of in those binary categories are not linearly juxtaposed and cannot enter into a direct and immediate or proximate relationship with each other. The system of correlative dialectics, of complementarity, is guided by the dynamic grasp of proper measure. That is, by the principle of do, which mediate the relation between the subject's self and the object's otherness. So as we have seen, do is a kind of experience-based rationality, which is not determined by a priori reason. It is a dynamic criterion which seeks to achieve the middle way in the mastering of every situation requiring choices or decisions. Li describes do as a dynamic structure of proportions, as something that changes according to the discrete conditions of a certain time and space. Li Zehou highlights that it is by no means an eternal mediator, and it does not always remain neutral. From an overall perspective, of course, do can sometimes be extreme. Therefore, it cannot be understood as a simple and stagnant mathematical middle between the two different possibilities, but rather as a vibrant situational principle. It must be found and appropriately applied, because in Li's view, concrete problems require concrete analysis. The inner logic of do is therefore operational rather than transcendental, we could say. So, but in the Chinese tradition, do is often closely associated with the concepts of harmony and the middle way, he or zhongyong in Chinese. In the West, such terms are usually seen as expressing an extremely conservative attitude based on a conflict avoidance and obedient conformity. For reasons of time, I cannot elaborate on the misinterpretation inherent in such prejudices, and can only emphasize that with regard to the concept of harmony, we must distinguish between the official ideologies of the contemporary Chinese state on the one hand, and the classical philosophical, especially Confucian understanding of these concepts on the other. So while the former, the ideological one, is based on the decree of unification, the latter, the philosophical one, is rooted in diversity. The way of equilibrium is also often misunderstood. Zhongyong is often translated in Western languages as the doctrine of the mean, which can be seen as an almost reactionary and surely completely uncreative method of always choosing the middle way in order to reach a static compromise between two opposing alternatives. In reality, however, it does not refer to a formal, statically unchanging middle, but to a state of equilibrium that changes from moment to moment. So I would like now to conclude with some thoughts about both of these philosophers. Notwithstanding such misconceptions I was just talking about, the dynamic concepts of harmony and equilibrium, to which Zehou is always oriented, are possibly comparable to Adorno's concept of peace, which I have also mentioned before, which he seeks in an unpeaceful whole, knowing that, and I quote, all images of reconciliation, peace, and tranquility resemble the image of death, as long as the world is as it is. The world is still as it is, and it may even evolve to the point where we find it even much worse. But much like the idea of perpetual peace, the two great scholars I have tried to bring into conversation in this presentation will always remain alive through their work and their ideas. In their aesthetic writings, both find their final refuge in art, which, in the face of our last breath, represents a completion of artistic subjectivity and a semblance of what lies beyond the reach of death. And with this idea, I would like to conclude my presentation, and I would like to thank you for your patient watching and listening. Thank you.